Okay, we are on chapter 16 now. I read one myself. I don't know what happened in it. What's in it for Darwin? Science changes one funeral at a time. Harvey Wise, 2002. Roughly 1 out of every 400 Black Americans develop sickle cell anemia. And those with this chronic hereditary disease, many of their red blood cells form rigid crescent or sickle shapes that cannot pass through capillaries. Affected children often die during adolescence of strokes, heart disease, and infections. Sickle cell anemia also causes sufferers painful, unpredictable health crises. Those children that survive are underweight and slow to mature. How is it that genetic, highly damaging disease can be so widespread amongst the Black population in the USA? What's in it for Darwin? Or more correctly asked, what is the evolutionary advantage that this mutation gives to Blacks that make its obvious disadvantages worthwhile? After all, as McElroy and Townsend point out, it is only the phenotypic characteristics that give some advantage of degree Darwinian fitness that are subject to selective action. At first glance, sickle cell anemia trait appears to provide Blacks with the very reverse of Darwinian fitness. After all, those with this genetic disorder tend to die in adolescence. Even if they don't, they're usually underweight, slow to develop, and often sick. These are not the type of people who might be anticipated to have larger families than the norm, so have a disproportionate effect on the human gene pool. As anticipated, the differential pre-production and mortality linked to this genotype in the U.S. are both negative. Sufferers reproduce less and die younger. We might expect that as a result, over time, the mutation responsible for sickle cell anemia would have disappeared. This has not been the case. Why? Malaria has plagued humanity for thousands of years. Even now, it affects an estimated 200 million people every year, causing some 2 million deaths. Tropical Africa, for example, kills about 1 million people annually, most of those being children. Disease also contributes to death from other causes, including pneumonia, anemia, and kidney failure. Anemia associated with malaria is linked to miscarriage, stillbirth, and low birth weight. Malaria is caused by a protozoan parasite of the genus Plasmodium, which infects red blood cells. These protozoans cannot live outside their host and depend completely on glucose enzymes metabolism of such cells to survive. Parasitic relationship eventually destroys red blood cells, usually at 2 or 3 day intervals, release of associated waste products and pigments, causing intermittent fever and chills seen in malaria sufferers. Plasmodium protozoa are spread from one human to another by 4 species of mosquitoes. At some time in the past, a point mutation occurred in one of the human DNA base pair codes the hemoglobin protein chains. Instead of glutamic acid at the 6th position, as is usually the case, valine was produced. This substance affected hemoglobin's level of oxygen affinity and led to this portion of the cell membrane into an irregular sickle shape. Plasmodium do not appreciate this abnormality. As a result, people with this sickling trait are unlikely to suffer as much from malaria. They are not clearly immune, but if affected, these are less severe. Heterozygotes usually do not exceed 30 to 40% of the population living in areas where malaria is commonplace. Sickling trait provides both normal and abnormal hemoglobin in every blood cell. This is a characteristic that increases the chances of surviving malaria to reproduce. In those who are homozygous for sickle cell anemia, this characteristic still helps to resist malaria. Their cells have nothing but abnormal hemoglobin. As a consequence, they develop sickle cell anemia, which, as described, is often fatal. The offspring of two patients who carry the trait, heterozygotes, have a 25% chance of being born with sickle cell anemia. Homozygotes, West African populations, it occurs in roughly 4% of children, most of whom die before they can reproduce. Sickle cell trait has survived in blacks, therefore, because despite the high toll sickle cell anemia takes, its trait is counterbalanced by the benefits reduced susceptibility to malaria that it provides. Interestingly, in regions where malaria has been wiped out, where sickling trait only brings disadvantages, its prevalence begins to decline. In the U.S., for example, it is now found in only 8.5% of blacks. As a result, sickle cell anemia occurs in a fraction of 1% of the black population, causing roughly 350 deaths annually. This brings us back to schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is usually first diagnosed in early adulthood or late adolescence. Suicide is far more common than usual in those who suffer from it, and often cause larger hospitalization, prevent employment, or meaningful relationships. Given all these evolutionary disadvantages one might have expected, schizophrenia is associated genetic aberrations that have disappeared long ago from the human gene pool. Schizophrenia occurs in roughly 1 in every 100 people. Shorter and Miller have demonstrated rather than dying out, schizophrenia has been increasing steadily. There seems to be only one logical conclusion to be drawn from this reality. Just as sickle cell trait helps protect against malaria at the cost of losses to sickle cell anemia, schizophrenia traits must provide some benefits in gene pool that outweighs the ravages of mental illness. How then do schizophrenia's genetic traits to increase Darwinian fitness? Wasn't it for Darwin? I've argued elsewhere in this book that there are at least 4 genetic traits that predispose those who carry them to the development of schizophrenia. These include the low enzyme activity variant of coated methylphenamase gene, the GSTM10 or allele required to produce a form of glutathione as transferase facility, the C677TT variant of 4-methylphenidate. What these 3 genetic aberrations appear to have in common is that they all, I want to say motherfucker, all result in higher than normal exposure to adrenochrome, a blend of adrenaline, or an abnormal susceptibility to its negative impacts. Since all 3 of these variants are quite widely distributed in the human populace, it seems likely that normal levels of adrenochrome must carry some evolutionary advantages. That is, there appears to be not 1, at least 3, and maybe 4 balanced genetic morphisms, suggesting that there is a balanced morphism in schizophrenia. It's not new. Sir Julian Huxley and colleagues, for example, argued in Nature 1964 that since the fertility of schizophrenics was only about 70% normal, the aberration causing this illness must also carry with it some unrecognized evolutionary advantage. I say that this may be resistant to surgical wound shock, kidney burns, especially with rapid recovery, partial immunity to epidemic diseases such as smallpox, bubonic plague. Also said that the heterozygote twin males who did not develop schizophrenia might be unusually fertile, although no firm evidence could be provided for this possibility. Come on. The balanced morphism idea has reappeared in the literature at various times. Toffer, for example, has argued that the family members of schizophrenics who do not develop the disease tend to be unusually intelligent. This concept underlies Horman's book, The Madness of Adam and Eve, in which he argues that schizophrenics can have people of all abilities and all strata of society, but it does with surprising frequency seem to affect families of the great, the good, the clever, the rich, the ambitious, the intellectual, and the creative. This belief is not new. Galton's eugenic ideas were rejected by Henry Maudsley, the greatest psychiatrist in London, second half of the 19th century, because he knew that schizophrenia occurred repeatedly in the great families of Victorian Britain. Maudsley recognized that an eugenic. I feel like people normally say eugenic, not an eugenic. No, that's right. Program E, designed to limit schizophrenia, would inevitably prevent the birth of some of Britain's future most creative and dynamic individuals. Ireson and Bull came to the same conclusion in the U.S. They found that U.S. presidents, philosophers, writers, scientists, and physicians had schizophrenic relatives that had been treated at McLean Hospital. There wasn't anyone wanting more details about the close link between brilliance and psychosis should read The Madness of Adam and Eve. I said that a recent Scandinavian study established that children of university graduates are almost twice as likely to develop schizophrenia as the children of non-graduates. Similarly, Carlson has shown that Icelandic males with psychotic family members seem to have more skills and abilities and contain higher achievers in a variety of fields than do those families without those who have this illness. Healthy relatives of psychotic patients, for example, publish more books of fiction, poetry, and perform better in school, particularly in mathematics. There is good evidence, however, and therefore, don't know where I got however, one or more of the genetic aberrations that increase susceptibility to schizophrenia also appear to encourage intelligence and creativity. Last word on the topic is left to Horman, who wrote, "What have I suggested in this book, The Madness of Adam and Eve? What I have suggested in this book, The Madness of Adam and Eve, is that the genes of schizophrenia, which are likely to include genes for bipolar disorders, dyslexia, intelligence, and type E, is responsible for most of the religious sense, less technological, or just creativity, associated qualities in modern humans." The question of Huxley co-authors, genes associated with schizophrenia might give family members greater immunity to infectious disease was supported also by Elliot Slater. However, the available evidence does not seem compatible with this idea. Torrey and Miller, for example, have documented that epidemics have frequently caused major life loss amongst institutionalized schizophrenics. This has been true of typhus, cholera, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and syphilis. It had been the major cause of death in English societies in the 19th century. The number of patients in which mental hospitals fell by 17% between 1950 and 1920, largely because of the erroneous high death rates associated with Spanish lady influenza pandemic. Evidence therefore seems clear. Genetic aberrations have very little protection, if any, against infections, diseases that have been common in the developed world during the past 2 centuries. Does not mean that such aberrations provide no protection against disease. Genetic groups that Andrachrome is affecting thyroid occurs developing lung cancer. Beyond this, our mouth is very quiet right now. It has been shown that the drug intradose, which contains powerful antioxidant cisplatin and adrenaline, is a very effective treatment for melanoma, cancers of lung, liver, breast, head, and neck. This drug is injected into the tumor mass, where it almost certainly creates elevated adrenochrome. It appears, therefore, that one of the major reasons genetic aberrations that are linked to schizophrenia are so widespread is because they provide a reduced risk for development of cancer. As the environment altered during the past 3 centuries, the cost of genetic aberrations has risen, filling the mental asylums with schizophrenics. Simultaneously, the benefits of such genetic variants have also increased as carcinogens have become more widespread and diverse, and the cancer mortality rates associated with them have risen rapidly, particularly amongst families that do not carry genes that encourage above normal adrenochrome production. Summary. Many economists will tell you that every strategy carries with it benefit and cost. Genetic aberrations, increasing the risk of schizophrenia, appears to promote religious sense, risk, artistic creativity, and leadership. They also seem to provide greater resistance to a wide range of cancers, especially that along. Whether you consider the Darwinian exchange that will have been worthwhile, we'll probably find out how you and your family the distribution of its additional costs and benefits. Okay. I don't know why I got up. I'm gonna put it away, but it's probably in the recording. That was Really Causes Schizophrenia by Harold D. Foster, as you can see.